Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us. And we are continuing our study through the Daodejing, and we are currently on chapter 46. Yeah, let me jump over to my screen here. And I'm actually going to start with a quick review of last week's text because I think it really is applicable to where the following passage is going. I think they tie together well. So just as a quick review, I really like this one too. Chapter 45 I thought is a fun chapter. But the idea then is it says, great accomplishment seems unfinished, but its use is continuous. Great fullness seems empty, but in use it is inexhaustible. So the theme that we see being developed here is that there's a misperception that is happening, that there's this idea of seems, that when we're looking at, in this case, both allusions to something that is continuous and inexhaustible would be different ways that the Tao has been talked about previously in the Daodejing. And so and in a real sense, we're looking at essentially all of the natural world when we're kind of engaging these questions of talking about the Tao in general. Because yes, we're talking about Tao as these patterns, but also it gets used almost interchangeably with this movement between absence and presence, this idea of emptiness and fullness. So when we're looking at these, it's a misperception of how we're viewing reality. And instead of seeing it as something that might be a great accomplishment or great fullness, we end up seeing it as something that's either unfinished or inexhaustible, or empty. And then it continues with the great straightness seems bent, great skill seems clumsy, and great eloquence seems mute. So we've got a terrible misperception of what's happening in terms of reality, at least according to this Taoist suggestion here. And the primary role that they see in human life that causes that misperception is things that we acquire from culture, different ways of looking at the world that aren't accurate or aren't the ways that we're supposed to do it. So a great deal of effort in the Daodejing is how do we take those filters off of our eyes so we can see more directly what is, so that we can notice the great accomplishment and the great fullness and straightness and skill and eloquence and so forth. But then where this passage goes is it says that when agitation wins, and maybe we'll just bring up the other one here too, and when tranquility wins. So we have kind of this almost like yin yang type of approach here. There's this agitation or side of it, and there's the tranquility side, and there's this idea of wins or overcome. So there's kind of like a tipping point where you get to that top, or you overcome, and then it switches. So that when agitation is in full swing, then it's saying that the cold arrives, and the reverse with tranquility. And if we think about the agricultural culture that this is coming up out of, then that cold is going to be more along the lines of the winter, or when things actually slow down. And then the hot is going to be more like the spring and summer, when life kind of starts again, and things are able to flourish. So there's the idea that if we're misperceiving the world and we see it as something that's broken and needs to get fixed, there's this sense of agitation, or this sense of, I need to get busy, I need to fix, I need to do things to make things right. And in doing so, it's saying that this agitation is going to lead to this idea of cold, that it's going to take us away from what's needed for life flourishing. But when we see properly, and we see it as something that's a great accomplishment and that it's full and so forth, then we can, in a sense, relax and be more at home in the world, which then allows for more of this flourishing to happen. And the conclusion then is that this clear and tranquil And this is, again, can be looked at a couple of different ways. Either we're perceiving the world as clear and tranquil, and therefore it's in the right mode, or we are clear and tranquil because the world is in the right mode. There's, a couple different ways that that could roll. But the key thing with this prior chapter is that this misperception of what reality is bringing about a way of being that is counterproductive to human flourishing, right? So if we're seeing the world as essentially broken and it drives us to think that we have to change things and fix things and control things, that ultimately that's not leading to an environment in which humans and other life can thrive. Hopefully that was a good way to summarize that last one. And let's see what happens now. With Tao under heaven, stray horses fertilize the fields. Without Tao under heaven, war horses are bred at the frontier. So we've got another contrast that we're kind of used to seeing. The idea of Tao being under heaven, and this would be again that Tianxia. So it's this in reference to essentially like the human sphere of interaction, all under heaven, or could be in reference to just the empire, or more specifically to like the social world that humans live in. So when it's saying with Tao there versus not being there, it's not that you can actually exclude or be apart from Tao. It's more of the idea that if the social world in which humans are operating is cognizant and working with this idea of Tao, things are going to be a certain way, versus if they are either ignorant of it or if they're actively rejecting it, then that social world is going to be experienced in a very different way. So here we've got the contrast being illustrated with horses. What are the horses doing? Are they helping the farmers? Are they fertilizing the fields, maybe pulling the plows, or are they being bred to be war horses? So, a couple things. One, we see that again, if there is either a deliberate or an ignorant misunderstanding of reality in terms of recognizing Tao and connecting with that versus, again, it could be either ignorance or active rejection, then it's going to change the way we're engaging in the world. We can think about that agitation, right? So if we're concerned, then we are doing the war horses. We're at war with our neighbors potentially, or at least we don't have safe relations with them, or we're looking at how do we conquer versus utilizing the horses for helping to farm or take care of the fields. So two very different ways of being in the world based off of, again, either a correct or an incorrect perception of the world. So then they say, given this, there's no greater calamity than not knowing what is enough. That's interesting. No greater calamity than not knowing. Another way this could be said is contentment, right? So I think we can take this in a couple of different directions. One is at a personal level, the idea of contentment, as we've seen before, is a key factor for how we have humans being, experiencing life in a more productive way, let's say. Uh, when we are not in a place of contentment, it drives a lot of different types of behaviors that maybe are not always the best. So here they're saying that there's no greater calamity, no worse thing that could happen than not knowing what is enough. At a personal level, we can see that, but if we think about the larger context brought up earlier in terms of war horses, then it reminds us that what we're looking at here also has to do with that governing aspect. So we might really want to pay attention to what does this mean if the person who is ruling, who is the emperor, who is the king, who is the president, who is whatever, Uh, do they know what is enough? And what happens if they don't? What happens if they are approaching life with that wrong perception? And it says, then there's no greater fault than desire for success. And that's interesting. But we have to think about this in terms of the context that it's saying here. So if our problem is that we're misperceiving the world and we see it as essentially broken or empty and that we're trying to fix it, then how we're looking at success is that, my perception is what is correct, and I'm now acting to try and bring that about. I am maybe driven by that because I don't have a sense of what is enough. So either, if we talk about this in terms of just trying to get more, but also in terms of, the general perception of the world being broken, then success is going to mean that I am somehow imposing my perception on what is correct onto the world and somehow achieving it, or at least maybe temporarily, if not in a greater way. So it can sound like exactly the opposite of what our culture is based off of, because what is it all about? It's about, there's never enough. There's always a desire being promoted to have more, to get more money, to get a bigger house, to get a better car, to have more friends or whatever it is. There's always this drive to not feel content, as well as this idea of how do we become successful. And that is another huge part of the imagery that's presented as far as what is the good life, or what does it mean to really be doing well? Well, it means you're successful. uh, Interesting that we have both of these being exactly called out here, and that the consequence of not keeping these both in check is the difference between, are we farming our fields or are we getting ready for war? What are your thoughts on this?
To me, it's saying, like, on a personal level, uh, don't worry, be happy. Like, there is no enough, there just is, and that's the way to go. Just accept it. Um, and on a larger level, it's saying, like, your leaders should lead by example, and if they don't know what enough is and they're constantly striving and never taking breaks, or, always trying to change things, then everybody else is going to lead or follow that, and then everyone's going to be doing that. So there you have calamity.
There's definitely calamity. Yeah. Anybody find it difficult to hear about not chasing success and not and learning to feel content? Does that feel like it's pushing you in the wrong direction?
And I feel like
No,
that's the right direction. I've
yeah,
felt like that for a while, I think, like the hustle culture, and everyone has to have like a side hobby that they make money from, and do this and do that, and constantly like get promoted and or get a new job within 2 years, or do this or do that. It's like, just chill. Okay.
I've learned that success does not equal happiness.
Mm.
Um, and a good example is with like famous Hollywood stars. You see so many of them end up having drug or alcohol issues or some sort of problem in their life, and they are some of the most successful people in the world, and they are not happy. And I think this is kind of getting to that point of saying just because you are looking for success does not mean you're going to be happy. And the other kind of side of that too is a lot of actors keep acting well past when they should retire because they don't know when enough is enough. And there's very few that say, hey, I've done I did a good job and I'm done. And some will just keep going and going and going until the end of their day, just because they don't feel like what they've done is enough.
Hmm. Yeah, it is interesting, the shifting tide. And I do think there's a bit of a generational thing that's happening too, where the social norms are beginning to shift in terms of what are people looking for, and what are they buying. I think in terms of what life is about has really started to transition quite a bit between, with my generation and above being far more driven by this idea of success and how do we get more, and how do we have all these things. But I hear a very different story from my kids and other people that are not even that much younger than me, where it seems like that whole paradigm has shifted quite a bit. It's going to be very interesting to see what this means culturally, because a lot of our whole economic system even is based on continual growth. That if you have things being more sustainable or even more relaxed, then things start to come apart and people panic, in terms of what's going to happen with the economy. An interesting thing, my I happen to have some exposure to what happens with the home healthcare uh, situation for people as they're getting older. And that balance between the older generation and the younger generation is really starting to invert, whereas there was before much more younger people than there were older people. Now it's going to be kind of flipping upside down. And what's going to happen with that whole situation? Um, there's so that growth mindset that we've been going with and trying to drive for is starting to really not be sustainable. Not that it ever was, but we were able to ignore the fact that it wasn't sustainable for quite some time. And now it's starting to come back around. Uh, this really, I think, speaks to a lot of that misperception of reality that was being brought up earlier, too. How do we keep having that growth? Well, we have to keep fighting for things. We have to conquer more territory. We have to use our employees in order to get them to produce more work. We have to, do what we have to do in the marketplace to manipulate people into buying things that they don't need, or chasing after dreams that are not really in their best interest, but are in the corporate best interest. It's a vicious cycle.
I'm thinking about what's happening in some schools where they are discouraging any type of competition and not trying to set up a system that rewards people who look to achieve the top grade, but that tries to keep something that allows everyone to feel good about themselves no matter what. I think there's some danger in doing that, but this really brings that into my thinking, and I look at our sports world and how we're so encouraged to go for the win, and the winner is the person that we should emulate.
Yeah, those are some interesting contrasts, aren't they? Because in the one sense, if we are trying to work in our education system to find a way to have it not be so competitive, but find a way where it's more cooperative, it can be dysfunctional in that approach too, where it's like, I remember in grade school with my kids, they were talking about everybody as scholars, and grade school kids. I'm like, wait, did we forget what this term actually means? And what do you mean they're all scholars? um, I get what they were trying to do in terms of this encouragement, but it's also, there's the danger of not seeing clearly in the other direction too, right? Where yes, there are differences, and it's not necessarily a wrong thing that there are differences. There's wrong ways to deal with differences, but it's not wrong to acknowledge that there's differences. So that uh, filter kind of in the other direction is also dangerous, that everything is the same and everything's okay and nobody really
Right,
needs to do anything. But then on the other hand, that competition at all costs, is dangerous. But also it's interesting with the sports thing, how much money is involved in that whole thing and how much we celebrate those things. It really says a lot, I think, about our culture in terms of its values when we see where people are spending their money and where things in our culture, are recognized in terms of how that money is being received or spent. So to Chaz's point about movie stars and about sports figures, these are two of the biggest things in our culture that are really celebrated. It's not teachers, it's not doctors, well, sometimes doctors, but it's I mean, it's like healthcare in general and teaching and farming and other things that are much more essential to life. It's interesting how little attention that those things receive. So it concludes then by saying that knowing that enough is always enough. Kind of a funny way to put it, but it is an interesting, I think, when we're talking about this idea of contentment or understanding enoughness, might be another way we talk about it, is we can sometimes look at that and say, well, that's just going to drive inactivity, or it's going to make everybody complacent, or that nothing's going to happen or change. And that's not necessarily true. I think there's a place in which we can recognize that things are in good balance, but then there's the goal of how do we keep things in good balance. So we might have a situation like if we were a farmer, let's say, to take it back to more of the agricultural situation that they had. Maybe we have a plot of land that produces enough food for the people that it's supposed to be meeting. It's not that we necessarily have to get more and more and more, but we do have to tend it. We do have to continue to work it. We do have to continue to pay attention to the seasons and the appropriate times to do things. Pay attention to what happens when the weather's good or bad, if it's cooperating or not cooperating. So it's not that you don't do anything or that it's about passivity or inactivity. It's about how do we work for maintaining that sustainable level of something that actually is allowing for human flourishing to happen, and also asking the question, what exactly constitutes human flourishing? Or really, I think in the Taoist perspective, they're taking it even above just that human level, but we could say the whole biosphere, what is necessary for life itself to really flourish. And that becomes the goal that's driving the behavior and the lens through which we're trying to look at things in terms of what our goals should be. And it produces a very different set of actions, but it doesn't produce inaction. And that's the critique I hear frequently, is that this idea of wu wei and contentment is about not doing anything. And that's not true. There's still a lot that has to be done. It's just how you show up in the world is looks different. And it's not the same goals, but it's not that there's no goals. What are your thoughts on that?
Again, it's saying balance. It's all about balance, like when it comes down to it, like balancing having goals versus knowing when enough is enough.
So when we're going through these different passages in the Daodejing, does it bring about this idea that it feels like it's saying not to do anything? Or do you see it as just realigning the goals?
I feel like it's saying not to do anything, because that's also like laziness, you know?
Anybody else have some thoughts?
Yeah.
My thought is that so much insecurity comes from a message that is often picked up when we're very young, saying we're not good enough. And so this passage, I think, speaks to me from that standpoint to say, yes, in fact, you can have confidence. Enough is you are good enough. You should be able to do whatever it is that you feel you can do.
Yeah. There's definitely, I think, in a lot of us, this sense that we are not enough, or that we're uh, suffering from, the imposter syndrome, or whatever it is, that we're always being presented with this ideal situation that's always far above and beyond where any of us are, and that does leave us with a sense that we are not enough. It is a healthy turnaround to look at ourselves a little bit differently, as well, actually I am what I'm supposed to be. uh you know maybe it's not me that's wrong, but the system that's wrong. Yeah, I constantly go back to that idea of that carved wood, and it just seems so appropriate for how so much of society works, in terms of trying to get people to conform to a way that works for those at the top, as opposed to life, and how we just need to re-envision this whole thing. It's gonna be very interesting. I think a little bit of a tangent here, but in thinking about the impact of AI in our world, we are, I think, initially thought that where it was going to be impacting things like jobs was going to be something like drivers, that driverless cars were going to show up, and that's going to create a problem for taxi drivers or truck drivers. And actually, it's interesting that where it's really started to take hold initially is kind of more around content producing. And so it's hitting at a different space in terms of where the workforce is being impacted. But we can see, I think, pretty clearly that even though it's not quite there yet, there's going to be a lot of areas in human life where there's going to be a faster way to deal with a lot of the things. Maybe not everything, but a lot of the things that we normally get paid to do. And so, what is that going to do for our economy when it's all about, uh, if we think about enoughness or worthiness for people, so much of that is based off of what we do as a job. How do we contribute to society? And if all of a sudden people aren't really needed for that, we're going to have to re-envision how we think about that whole system. And especially in terms of money, because if people aren't needed to actually generate the wealth that's generated, then where does that go? Is it all going to just go up to that handful of people that are controlling all the things, or is it what's going to happen to the everyday Joe? So a lot of the futurists have been trying to envision for some time now what an economy would look like if it wasn't based on everybody working. We saw even in the last presidential race with Andrew Yang, who I think it was really bringing up the question about like a UBI, universal basic income, or base income. And it's really going to be causing us to think through a lot of these established ways of organizing society. They're just going to really be challenged even more and more. And it's going to be an interesting time of change, I think, where we figure out how do we redo life in the age where something like AI is really starting to come to the fore. You guys have any thoughts around those lines and how that fits in with this idea of enoughness or economies or growth mindset?
Yeah, I have thoughts. I don't know if they're necessarily all together yet, but I feel like we're gonna go down to like a 4-day work week, and maybe not anytime soon, but I feel like humans will work less. And even if we don't get a universal basic income, I feel like everything will start to cost less if we don't have something like that, because people are working less. But I don't know, it's hard to imagine, but it's like this chapter is a little validating in my thoughts of like the system is wrong and has been for a while.
Mhm.
And so that feels good, and I hope that AI kind of helps us get away from this hustle, success, goal-based culture that we have at the moment. But I don't appreciate the AI art. I will say that.
Anybody else have some thoughts?
I do, but it's a rabbit hole, and we don't have enough time in this call for this.
Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's only we've still got another 20 minutes or so. Do you want to just throw it out there and see if it's something we can tackle?
It's kind of to what Taylor was already kind of talking about, and it's the fact of this type of where I feel like we're at the beginning stages of a different era, with AI and all of this technology that's starting to, people are afraid of Terminator, but I see it going a different direction of, like you said, there's going to be like a global income type thing, and there's going to be a point where people don't work at all anymore, and it's going to be more focusing on leisure rather than work, and that's going to change to a different paradigm.
Like Wally.
Not to the degree of everybody's just floating around on a chair, but my thought was more of people are going to start focusing on more of like art and things that don't require what we do
Hobbies.
today. Exactly. Like it's going to be a different society where eventually it's going to get to the point like where money isn't the driving factor. It's going to be some other factor of scientists and artists are going to be the rock stars because those are the ones that are making huge changes in a world where um, work is viewed differently. It's not a necessity anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting, if you were to take somebody and ask them, what if, you were going to be given $10 million tomorrow, what would you do with your life? Because obviously you're not going to have to work to make any more money. And maybe somebody's going to take maybe a year and do some traveling and go see the world or something like that. But then it seems that we're not content just to do that there's still a drive to do something else, right? And it's not that we're trying to make money or that that's the only reason we're driven to pursue whatever our passions are. It's the money is necessary for how those basic needs are being met and how we can show up in the world, but it's not ultimately the thing that drives us. I know a ton of people, my parents included, who, when they retired and didn't actually have to work anymore, are busier now than they were when they were working. It's like, there's just something about humans. It's not going to just become, I think when you see the Wally thing that Taylor was bringing up of people just becoming like these floating couch potatoes, there's something else that's very wrong about the system, right? There's some type of sedative that is happening that is causing people to lose hope, and they seek some type of escapism through, either drugs or eating or some other thing that is, trying to dull the pain. And that's a very different condition than simply not having to worry about money. Not having to worry about money doesn't make people turn into couch potatoes. It's other things that are broken in the system that's causing that type of issue.
I think there's going to be a shift in what people values, like because so many things are going to be made by computers and technology. I think there's going to be a shift in favoring the artisan, like handmade things, and like there's going to be value in something that was made by more value, I would say, in something that was made by a human.
And
Yeah.
to Jim's point earlier, I do see there is a generational shift. The younger generation is no longer just working just to get the paycheck. They are searching for meaning behind what they do. Versus older generations have kind of learned that you figure out something that you're good enough to do at, and you make the money to survive off of, and then you get to do the fun things. And the younger generation, I think, has learned that that is not a life to live, and it doesn't make them lazy. It just means they are more focused on what their goals are, and they want to achieve them at an age where they can enjoy those goals versus hitting 70, 80 years old and then being able to doing it. That's part of the other side of that drive for that too, is the fact that the older generation got to retire at a younger age, so they could still enjoy things even if they did work a job they didn't like for 20, 30 years. Versus the younger generation is now being told that we're not going to retire until we're 75 years old, which is not a life to live. So I think that is pointing to a directional change in that generation where they are trying to seek more meaning at a younger point in life.
Yeah, I think especially Gen Z, like if they're at a company that isn't treating them well, they're gonna leave. So I think companies are going to have to adjust to their people and really make sure that they're making them happy rather than just giving them benefits and pay, like treating them well and making sure they're feeling fulfilled in what they do and valued.
Pizza Friday.
That's right.
Yeah, it's interesting to see, even in terms of like gifts, whereas before, people would be about how do I get more things, and it seems like gifts now are focused more on experiences. How do we do something and how do we do it with other people, as opposed to, how do I just get the bigger TV or something like that. It's definitely an interesting shift in what's happening. Well, where I want to take the balance of this then is we're going to bump it back up from the individual and even some of the social stuff, but back to the ruler that a lot of this book deals with. And it has a lot of concerns about the dispositions of rulers. And this one brings up a couple of them. And the first one is this idea of personal desire. So maybe if we are going to talk about this, we have to back up for just a minute and think about what does it mean if we are looking to Tao, or if we are looking to nature to understand how government should work? That becomes a very interesting question. What exactly are we pulling on from that in order to think about how we structure our social systems? Well, one of the things that they, and this isn't just within Taoism, but in many of the different philosophical trends within this classical Chinese period, would focus on this idea that of more like the idea that it's an office in terms of the ruler, that it's not about a greatly skilled person or a conqueror that rises to the top, but it's necessarily someone who is in a position, who has a role, and that role is ultimately for the people. When we see that idea of the mandate of heaven that comes into play when the Zhou dynasty overthrows the Shang dynasty, it is a very almost like democratizing type of a position that this mandate of heaven starts to play, that if the ruling empire is not actually serving the people, then they are going to lose their mandate to be able to rule. So why is somebody in that position? It has to be not because they're trying to achieve their personal goals. It can't be about achieving wealth. It can't be about trying to gain power or, other types of influence. It has to be for that office, in the sense of like serving the office. So personal desires is frequently attacked in the Daodejing, to the extent that we're talking about people in positions of leadership and why they are there. Doesn't mean that we don't have certain desires. We all do. It's about not having no desires, but having our desires rightly ordered, especially if we're talking about being in a position of leadership. The other one that becomes very toxic is showing favor. And it's really kind of connected with the third one, which is about partiality. So if we think back to one of the more abrasive chapters, chapter 5, where it says that heaven and earth are not kind, and therefore the sage is not kind either, it's bringing in this idea that the way Tao and nature unfold is really not taking into consideration, issues of class or status or anything for that matter. It's just unfolding the way things unfold. And so if we're thinking about how would we model what we do in our social world based off of the natural world, one of the things is that if you're going to have certain laws in place, they need to be things that can be executed impartially, right? And even in our own legal system, we have that idea of blind justice, that it's not actually not supposed to take into consideration, somebody's status or their money or any of those things. Is supposed to be evenly and equally applied. So when we start to have a disproportionate way that the laws are enforced based on status, or if we have our leaders showing favor to other family members or close friends, giving them positions, or if we are seeing them chasing after their personal desires for growth or gain or success, then these things are going to necessarily create problem, because it's not going to be a system that is actually going to work for the people. It's turned into a system that's designed to serve the emperor. And one of the interesting passages that we've seen come up a couple of times now is the need to recognize that the low is the foundation of the high, that the reason that high office is there is not for the sake of the high office. It's there for the sake of all the people underneath it. It's a way of being able to focus the energies and attention to help organize a social organization, a social group, for the benefit of the group, not for that individual. And if that gets turned around, that's where the wheels come off the cart and we start to have all kinds of disasters. And I think this is actually a very interesting critique that is still valid when we're looking at why are we having problems with our social systems? Where has our political offices gone of late? They seem to have forgotten that idea about impartiality and not showing favoritism and chasing, personal gain. Maybe we need to try and recapture more of our system that's supposed to be in place in terms of that democratic process of trying to hold people accountable to the goals that they were supposed to be there. How do we get that money out of our political system that's so corrosive? Still, I think some very valid points for today. If you've been watching this video and you'd like to be a part of our live Zoom presentations on Friday mornings, You can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get links for our Zoom class, as well as directions to our in-person if you happen to be in the Southern California area on Sunday mornings. So thank you guys, and we'll see you next time.
Hey, thanks, Jim.